Mysterious and suspicious deaths and disappearances. Accidental death, suicide, or murder. Tragic, bizarre, mysterious and sometimes too weird for words, so sit back, relax and open your mind to the mysterious. Number 666. The 2009 mysterious death, and possible murder and cover-up, of Amanda Wenkowski shocked Buffalo, New York when her nude body was found frozen, bent in half in a trash can. Murder victim's role as informant. Amanda Wenkowski was a 20-year-old young woman who, despite doing well in school and coming from a loving home, became addicted to heroin when she was 18 years old. By the time she was 20, she was crashing on a couch and doing all sorts of things to bring in money to feed her addiction. The couch she was crashing on belonged to a man named Adam Patterson. On December 5, 2008, Adam drove Amanda to an appointment with a man she knew as Justice. Justice's real name is Antoine Garner. After waiting for hours for her to come out of Antoine's house, his story goes, Adam left. Amanda was never seen alive again. On the morning of January 9, 2009, BPD officer Thomas Duffy was searching for suspected homicide victim Amanda Wenkowski, when at 7:55 a.m. he found a blue garbage tote exactly as described in a tip he'd received in an alcove of New Covenant United Church of Christ, which sits at the corner of Clinton and Spring Street in Buffalo's East Side, right across the street from Antoine Garner's house. Amanda's naked, frozen body was inside. Between January 9, 2009 and February 5, 2009, BPD continued their investigation into Amanda's murder. But on February 5, the medical examiner's report came out. The cause of death, it stated, was an accidental drug overdose, even though there was evidence she was strangled to death. A key motive in her brutal slaying, Amanda Wenkowski's case is a weird one. This could be the most massive foul-up I've ever seen on the part of law enforcement, or the most massive cover-up. But the more I know about it, the more I believe it's a combination of both. Peter A. Reese, the attorney representing the family of Amanda Wenkowski, whose frozen, battered and nude body was found stuffed into a garbage tote on Buffalo's East Side in January 2009, shakes his head. Amanda's death was a homicide and everyone in Western New York knows it, but, for whatever reason, the authorities don't want to admit it, he said. The petite, blonde 20-year-old had the looks of a prom queen and a heroin habit that led her into the dark netherworld of prostitution and work as a police informant. It was a high-risk lifestyle that got her killed, but, because the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office labeled her death as accidental, it has never been properly investigated. That job has been left to her mother, Leslie Brill-Mees-Roll, whose 6-year battle to pry loose information about her daughter's horrific end from recalcitrant officials from the Buffalo Police Department, the Erie County Sheriff's Department and the Medical Examiner's Office, all of whom had to be dragged kicking and screaming through court to give up anything at all. She's been assisted over the past nearly 7 years, on and off the record, by a small army of current and former law enforcement officials, attorneys, journalists, and forensic experts. Can see the obvious, that Amanda was murdered by a person or persons unknown, and that her killer or killers most likely walk among us today. The basic facts in the case are widely known. Amanda, who graduated from Niagara-Wheatfield High School in 2006 with a Regents diploma, was tending bar at Cocktail Bob's on Cuddaback Avenue late on the afternoon of December 5, 2008, when she received a phone call from a man later identified as Adam Patterson, who lived with her on the Tuscarora Reservation in Lewiston and was also involved in the drug and prostitution rackets. He was old enough to be her father, and law enforcement sources described him to the Niagara Falls Reporter as her pimp. Amanda asked another barmaid to cover for her, and Patterson arrived shortly afterward to pick her up. Together they drove to Buffalo, where Patterson had arranged for her to trade sex for drugs with a man named Antoine Garner, a hulking, 300-pounder who was later convicted of a sex offense in which the victim was beaten and choked. According to Patterson, who was waiting out front in his car near the corner of Spring and Clinton Streets in East Buffalo, Amanda called and texted him after about an hour to say it was going to take longer than she expected. Incredibly, Patterson told police, he drove away and left her there. Garner told a different story. He said Amanda stopped by, stayed a few minutes and left. That was it. Both agreed they hadn't seen her since. The family reported her as missing and began canvassing the neighborhood where she'd last been seen, putting flyers up on utility poles and asking residents if they knew anything about the young woman's disappearance. Police initially suspected foul play and questioned both Patterson and Garner. Detectives conferred with the Erie County District Attorney's Office, but it's tough to prove murder without a corpse. 5 weeks after she went missing, on the morning of January 9, 2009, police discovered Amanda's body. According to the pastor of the church, the toad had been placed there sometime during the night, since it would have been noticed the day before. It had been reported stolen a week or so earlier by a nearby resident, police said. The naked body had been folded in half and put in the toad with hands, head, and feet down and bottom end up. Amanda's long blonde hair had been shaved, there were numerous lacerations and bruises, her tongue had been bitten in half and finger marks were apparent on her throat. Homicide detectives were now certain they had a murder on their hands. Both Garner and Patterson were placed under surveillance. When the body thawed sufficiently, an autopsy was performed the next morning. And the story became even stranger than it already was. The medical examiner's office determined Amanda had died of an accidental heroin overdose. It is difficult to determine how they reached this conclusion, since it was several weeks before the toxicology report came back. Also unusual was the fact that the autopsy report was signed by no fewer than 4 medical examiners. A law enforcement source close to the investigation told the Niagara Falls Reporter that there are never 4 medical examiners on duty at the same time in Erie County. I've looked at a lot of autopsy reports, hundreds, the source said. This is completely unheard of. Very rarely you might find one signed by 2 medical examiners, but Amanda's was obviously signed by people who weren't even in the building when the autopsy was performed. Buffalo homicide detectives disagreed with the conclusion that she'd died of an overdose as well. Sources present at the autopsy said an argument erupted between the medical examiners and homicide detectives, who were certain that Amanda had been murdered. But once the autopsy report was issued, the investigation ground to a complete halt. Police only investigate crimes. The report made no mention of the abrasions, lacerations, and bruises that appeared all over the dead girl's body. Looking at the same data, Dr. Michael Secreca, a forensic pathologist from Albany, ruled that the amount of opiates found in the young girl's blood were innocuous, and that she had died of strangulation. Dr. Lawrence Kobylinski of John Jay College, a consultant to attorneys in the areas of forensic biology, serology, and DNA analysis for more than 20 years, also concluded that the substances in Amanda's blood were insufficient to cause her death. He did note, however, high levels of GHB, known as the date rape drug. Taking a cue from the Keystone Cops, the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office, which had missed the presence of GHB in the initial report, now amended the document to reflect the new findings. Incredibly, the medical examiner's office now said it was the GHB, which it hadn't even noticed in the first place, had likely caused Amanda's death by asphyxiation. But Amanda's mother, Leslie Brill, and several law enforcement sources familiar with the case, have another theory about what happened. Enter Ryan Warm, aka Dirty Cop. Warm was a Niagara Falls City police officer who often worked narcotics cases. In December 2008, the same month that Amanda went missing, he was arrested by federal agents and charged with a boatload of offenses that included drug dealing and using his police-issued firearm in the commission of numerous felonies. At the time of his arrest, prosecutors said Warm could possibly face the death penalty if convicted on all counts, but a plea bargain resulted in a 13-year sentence for the disgraced cop. There were several crimes alleged by prosecutors that were not covered in the plea agreement, and charges related to them were dismissed after the sentence was imposed. Those accusations included the alleged rape of 2 women, forcing a woman to perform oral sex on him while he was on duty, and threatening a woman after an attack, saying he would take her to the Tuscarora Reservation and shoot her. Amanda said he used to come into Cocktail Bob's all the time, Ms. Roll told the reporter. She had been working with the city police, the Niagara County Sheriff's Department and the Buffalo Police for a while, making buys for them. She would do anything for Ryan, aka Dirty Cop. Ms. Roll said she remembers an afternoon during the summer of 2008, when she noticed a strange car parked in the driveway of the house where she and Amanda lived. Because of what she'd told me, I knew it was the police, Amanda's mom said. I went out and asked them what they were doing, and they said they were waiting for Amanda. I told them I would do it, that I didn't want her involved. They just laughed, and she came out and got in the car and they drove off. The day before she went missing, Amanda's mom said, Amanda had registered at Niagara County Community College in a number of criminal justice courses. Her daughter's ultimate aim, she said, was to become a corrections officer. She wanted to get away from the life and she loved working for the police, she said. She told me they were paying her a lot of money. Ms. Roll said she finds Amanda's involvement with law enforcement during the final months of her short life especially troubling in light of the mountain of mistakes made by investigators once her body was discovered. A law enforcement source familiar with the case doesn't disagree. Did she go to the house to do the deal, and they'd been tipped off to the fact that she was a snitch so they killed her? The source asked. I don't think you can rule that out. At the time of his arrest, Worm was specifically charged with alerting drug dealers to undercover police activity. As regulars at Cocktail Bob's, how well were he and Adam Patterson acquainted? His specific threat to one of his female victims to take her out to the Tuscarora Reservation and shoot her seems especially troubling. Police might be investigating these questions, but for an obviously botched autopsy report, extensively amended, that rules Amanda's death accidental, whether because of a heroin overdose, too much GHB, rough sex, or even, at one point, the suggestion of suicide. So Ms. Roll aka Amanda's mom contacted Worm herself, through the Federal Department of Corrections Corelink's email system earlier this year. Initially he was friendly. Leslie. What's up, the convicted cop wrote. But when she got specific, asking him about Cocktail Bob's and whether he knew anyone who might know something about Amanda's murder, Worm broke off contact. That Amanda allowed Patterson to drive her to Garner's Buffalo home on the evening of December 5, 2008, in order to trade sex for drugs is beyond dispute. DNA taken from the young woman's body belonged to Garner, Patterson, 2 unidentified men and 2 unidentified women. That she met a violent end seems also beyond dispute. Despite the findings of the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office, Buffalo homicide detectives present at the autopsy, Dr. Sikrica and Kobyliski and Dr. Sylvia Comparini, a Los Angeles-based forensics expert who conducted an independent autopsy at the family's request, agree unanimously on this point. The other thing that is beyond dispute is the fact that, for the past 6 years, the Buffalo City Police Department, the Erie County District Attorney's Office and the Erie County Sheriff's Department have done everything in their power to prevent Amanda's family, and the public at large, from knowing the true facts of the case. When someone in government doesn't want to release information, there is always a reason, said one law enforcement source familiar with the case. It could be to cover up an embarrassing mistake, or it could be something darker. And until you find out, you just can't know. For Peter A. Reese and his partners Michael Kuzma and Dare Brian Irwin, who are representing Ms. Roll in finding justice for Amanda, the case has become something of a crusade. I have never seen a case with such emotional impact. They say the worst thing that can happen to a mother is to bury a child, Reese said. Leslie lost her child first to drugs and the streets, then later to an unspeakably tragic death. Now it appears that the government, which exists solely to serve us all, has compounded her pain by years of needless delays and foot dragging. One medical examiner said that she died of a drug overdose. Another medical examiner said she was obviously strangled to death. The DA ordered the Buffalo, New York PD to stand down their investigation. Why? We smell a cover-up. Number 5. Deaths of 19 prostitutes pose a mystery in Miami. The circumstances suggest foul play. The bodies of all 19 women were found in the same section of the city in outside areas like fields, or they were behind buildings. Yet medical examiners said they had found no wounds on the bodies, no bruises, no scratches, no needle marks. Nothing. One might question, Dr. Davis wrote, how such deliberate deaths could occur in the absence of obvious injury patterns that we see in most homicidal strangulations and suffocations. It is not at all difficult to inflict enough neck pressure to result in helplessness and loss of consciousness within seconds. But rather than create alarm, the medical examiner's report has been received warily. The Miami Herald did not even print the article about it on its front page. And police officials, while saying they are investigating the cases as murders, say they are not convinced that the deaths were really homicides. We are not discounting that there could be other explanations, said John Farrell, chief of detectives of the Metro-Dade Police Department. As to the motivation of Dr. Davis, I think he was under some pressure in press stories to come up with a reason. Skepticism about report. Police officers say it is difficult to believe that at least some of the victims would not have struggled with their killer. They say serial killers of prostitutes tend to be the most vicious murderers of all, slashing or otherwise mutilating their victims, not leaving them unscarred. The police say they have not abandoned the theory that the women died from the combined stimulation of sex and crack. While they acknowledge that the levels of cocaine found in the victims were insufficient for an overdose, they say their experience with crack is that a small amount can induce fatal psychotic fits. But the police also acknowledge holes in the cocaine theory. 2 victims had no cocaine in their bodies. And with the exception of one, the deaths have all occurred in the same area directly north of Midtown. If the deaths were indeed linked to sex and crack, why would they be limited to that section? In interviews, some leading medical examiners elsewhere in the country cautioned that while they were not familiar with the specifics of the Miami deaths, they thought Dr. Davis's conclusions were plausible. The examiners said they were not seeing a rash of similar prostitute deaths in their cities, and this led them to conclude that the sex cocaine theory was probably inaccurate. As for there being virtually no signs of trauma on the victims' bodies, Dr. Charles Hirsch, the chief medical examiner of New York City, said, "It's not unusual for there to be no signs. It's perfectly consistent with a sound evaluation of cases like this to consider history and circumstances. Sometimes that's about all you have to go on." All the dead women, who ranged in age from 14 years old to 32, were black, except one, who was Hispanic. Most were crack users, the police said. All were found on their backs, with either their dresses pulled up or their pants pulled down. Their legs were spread. "It is my considered conclusion," Dr. Davis wrote, "that the repetitive pattern of body position, location, and scene circumstances constitutes a reasonable conclusion as to manner of death, homicide." For months officials here have been debating the deaths, the latest of which occurred April 4 and the first 2.5 years ago. One assistant medical examiner speculated that the women, who the police say were prostitutes, may have died from the combined stimulation of sex and crack. This week, Dade County's medical examiner, Dr. Joseph H. Davis, issued his formal determination: the women were murdered. He did not address whether the victims had been killed by the same person, but the announcement raised the specter of a serial killer preying on local prostitutes. Dr. Davis said a re-examination of photographs and autopsy reports had revealed that pressure had been applied to the victims' necks or mouths. Dr. Richard Suviron, an expert in forensic dentistry whose findings helped convict the serial killer Ted Bundy, aided the medical examiner in his evaluation. The police would not comment on what physical evidence had been found at the death scenes, whether, for example, they had found hairs from the killer or fingerprints. They have questioned at least 2 men but have not brought charges. Meanwhile, police officers have been warning black prostitutes to be wary. They say that, in addition to the 19 deaths, crack use has brought about an overall increase in brutality against prostitutes. The prostitutes' reaction has been fatalistic. Chief Farrell said, "They tell us, if you're not a user, you don't understand the high. They tell us to leave them alone." Number 4. Springfield 3, USA, 1990s. A day after graduating high school, 2 girls and a mother disappeared into the night at around 2 a.m. Stacy, Suzanne, and Suzanne's mother Cheryl Levitt were never seen again. This particular case is a bundle of all things bizarre. 3 people went missing, there was no sign of forced entry or struggle, and everything around their house was intact, including Levitt's and Streeter's dog. On June 7, 1992, the Springfield, Missouri Police Department was notified of the disappearance of 3 women from a residence in central Springfield. The parents of Stacy McCall, one of the missing women, contacted the police department in reference to their daughter's disappearance from the home of Cheryl Levitt and Suzanne Streeter, the other 2 missing women. Upon officers' arrival, the house bore no signs of a struggle, but rather the appearance of the missing women being abducted. All personal property was left behind, including purses, money, clothing, cars, keys, cigarettes, and the family dog. Stacy McCall and Suzanne Streeter had graduated from high school the day before their disappearance and were last seen at approximately 2:15 a.m. on June 7, 1992, when they left a graduation party in a nearby community en route to the Levitt/Streeter home at 1717 E. Del Mar, Springfield. It appeared as though they had arrived at the residence because their clothing, jewelry, purses, and vehicles were still at this location. Suzanne's mother, Cheryl Levitt, was last heard from at approximately 11:15 p.m. on June 6, 1992, when she talked with a friend about painting a chest of drawers. Levitt's car, purse, keys, etc., were left at the residence, and it appeared as though her bed had been slept in when friends and police arrived to check the residence. Cheryl Levitt, November 1, 44, 5, 110 pounds, brown eyes, short bleached blonde hair, naturally curly hair, longer on top and short in the back. Cheryl Levitt has a thin build and has freckles on her neck and upper chest area. Stacy McCall, white female, date of birth April 23, 74, 5'3". 120 pounds, blue eyes, dark blonde hair to the middle of her back with sun-lightened ends. She has freckles on her face and a dimple in the middle of her chin. Suzanne, Susie, Streeter, white female, date of birth March 9, 73, 5'2", 102 pounds, brown eyes, straight bleached blonde, shoulder-length hair, large teeth with no dental work. She has a 3.5 inch scar on top of her right forearm and a small tumor in the left corner of her mouth, which gives the appearance that she has something in her mouth. With the assistance of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, Missouri State Highway Patrol, and numerous other law enforcement agencies, an extensive investigation into the lives of the missing women has been conducted with no positive leads concerning the reason for their disappearance or their location. A reward fund of $42,000 has been established for the location and prosecution of the persons responsible for the abduction of the 3 women. Anyone with information into the disappearance of Mrs. Levitt, Miss Streeter, and Miss McCall is requested to contact the Springfield Police Department or Crime Stoppers. Number 3. The chilling disappearance of Breonna Maitland. On March 19, 2004, 17-year-old Breonna Maitland left her shift at the Black Lantern Inn around 11:20 p.m. What happened next remains a mystery to this day. Earlier that same day, Maitland had completed a test to obtain her GED and had lunch with her mother, Kelly, to celebrate. The two then went out shopping where, according to Maitland's mother, something, or someone, caught Maitland's eye outside a store. She went outside to investigate, and when her mother joined her there later, the young woman seemed tense, shaken, and agitated. Maitland said that she needed to get home to prepare for her evening shift at the Black Lantern Inn and, not wanting to pry into her daughter's private life, Kelly drove Maitland back to the apartment that she shared with her friend Jillian Stout. It was the last time she would see her daughter. The year before, Brianna Maitland had decided to move out of her family home in order to be closer to her friends, who attended a different high school 15 miles away. Things did not go according to plans, however, and soon after Maitland dropped out of school entirely. Despite this rough patch, it took the young woman only a few months to secure more stable living arrangements, including working 2 jobs. According to those who knew her, Brianna Maitland had gotten her life back together. She was even talking about attending college part-time once she received her GED results. Before leaving for her shift at the Black Lantern Inn, Maitland had left a note for her roommate saying that she would be home after work. When her shift at the restaurant was over, several of her co-workers asked her to stay and have dinner with them, but she said that she was tired and needed to get home and rest because she had to work at her second job in the morning. Her co-workers said that Maitland got into her 1985 Oldsmobile alone and drove off into the night. The next day, several passing motorists reported an abandoned car with its rear end stuck in the wall of a vacant building, the Dutchburn farmhouse, about a mile from the Black Lantern Inn. When state troopers investigated, they found Brianna Maitland's 1985 Oldsmobile. Around the car, police found loose change, a water bottle, and an unlit cigarette. Inside the car, 2 of Brianna Maitland's uncashed paychecks and various other personal effects were found. The trooper who first visited the scene assumed that the car had been abandoned there by a drunk driver and had a tow truck take it to the impound lot. He drove down to the Black Lantern Inn in an attempt to get more information, but finding it closed, radioed in his report and thought little more of it at the time. However, even before the trooper came to the car, several passers-by found the scene suspicious, or at least interesting enough to stop and take photographs. The resulting image of the car stuck partway into the wall of the old, gray house presents a strangely haunting taboo, and more than one observer, including Maitland's mother, has said that they felt a sort of instinctive chill upon seeing the photograph. "My stomach rolled," Kelly Maitland later said of her immediate reaction to the photo. "I started to shake. I saw evil in the picture." Maitland's mother said that she knew immediately that it wasn't her daughter who had left the car in such a state. However, it wasn't until several days after the car was discovered that Brianna Maitland's disappearance was recognized. With plans already in place to spend the weekend with her boyfriend, Jillian Stout thought little of Maitland's note when she saw it that Friday night. It wasn't until Jillian returned home the following Monday and found the note in the same place that she began to worry. Assuming that her roommate had spent the weekend with her parents, Jillian didn't call until that Tuesday, when she phoned Kelly and Bruce Maitland. They, in turn, began calling around to their daughter's various friends, none of whom reported having seen her since her final shift at work. Finally, Maitland's panicked parents called the police and filed a missing persons report, but by then their daughter had already been gone for almost a week. In the years since, innumerable theories have come forward about what happened to Maitland that night. Police and Brianna's family almost immediately began receiving phone calls from people claiming that the young woman had been kidnapped, that her body was at the bottom of a river or lake, had been tied to a tree in the woods, or disposed of at a hog farm. One call claimed that Brianna Maitland was being held against her will in the house of 2 known drug dealers in a town not far away. While the 2 men were investigated in relation to the disappearance, neither was ever charged. This was only one avenue investigated by police. Maitland had recently been in an altercation with another teen at a party, supposedly over a boy. The other young woman had punched Maitland in the face, leaving her with a broken nose and concussion. She filed charges against the friend, which were dropped by the police 3 weeks after her disappearance. Police stated that they investigated the friend, and she had been cleared of any involvement. A more chilling possibility was that Brianna Maitland's disappearance might have been somehow connected to the disappearance of Maura Murray just a month before and about 90 miles away. Investigators, however, never revealed any connections between the 2 cases. Later, a potential connection between Brianna Maitland's disappearance and serial killer Israel Keyes was brought to light, but the FBI eventually ruled out Keyes's involvement in the case. Keyes later killed himself in prison in 2012 after confessing to a string of rapes and murder. Other theorists speculated that Breonna Maitland was still alive, either she had run away or been sold into sex slavery. In 2006, a woman who resembled Maitland was spotted on security footage at the Caesars World Casino in Atlantic City, though the woman was never identified. In 2016, police revealed that they had recovered DNA samples from the car at the time of Maitland's disappearance, but to this day, what happened to her on that dark March night remains a mystery. Number 2. The Baroness of the Galapagos. Aloise Wehrborn de Wagner-Bosquet, known as the Baroness of the Galapagos, was a young Austrian woman who disappeared in 1935 on the remote island of Floriana in the Galapagos archipelago, in the eastern Pacific Ocean. Floriana had become famous in Germany after it was colonized in 1929 by a German couple, Friedrich Ritter and Dori Strauch, who eked out a primitive living in a house made from rocks and driftwood. Their celebrity attracted other German families to Floriana, seeking what they saw as a utopian lifestyle. In 1933, the Baroness arrived, along with her two young German lovers, Robert Philippson and Rudolf Lorenz, and an Ecuadorian servant. After setting up house on the island, she announced plans to build a luxury hotel and in the meantime, built a reputation for flamboyant living among the simple colonists of Floriana. On March 27, 1934, the Baroness and her lover Philippson disappeared. Another German colonist claimed they had embarked on a passing yacht bound for Tahiti, but there were no records of such a yacht visiting the Galapagos at that time. A few days later, the Baroness's other lover, Rudolf Lorenz, hurriedly left Floriana in a boat with a Norwegian fisherman, bound for the South American mainland. Their mummified bodies were found months later, stranded on a waterless island where their boat had floundered. Researchers speculate that Lorenz killed the Baroness and Philippson, and that other colonists helped him cover up the murders, but the disappearance of the Baroness of the Galapagos has never been solved. Back in the 30s, the Galapagos were largely uninhabited and far from the tourist attraction it has morphed into today. For Berlin Dr. Friedrich Ritter and his lover and former patient, Dori Strauch, the promise of solitude was too much to resist. The pair embarked on a 4-week journey from Berlin to South America, where they waited a month in Guayaquil before sailing to the island of Floriana. Formed by volcanic activity, the Galapagos archipelago is made up of 13 major islands with 7 smaller islands. When Ritter and Strauch landed on Floriana, the volcanic island proved unforgiving and harsh, subject to droughts and blistering heat. The pair managed to carve a home for themselves among the elements. Dori and Friedrich were in many ways living out their own embodiment of Adam and Eve, and they were called the Adam and Eve of the Galapagos, said Dana Goldfein, whose documentary The Galapagos Affair chronicles the earliest inhabitants of the islands. Despite the fact that they went to find utter solitude, they were discovered by the tabloids, mostly because letters they wrote home to friends and family were published. The friends and family sent them off to the papers. While headlines speculated, wondered, and ridiculed Ritter and Strauch, a German family, the Whitmers, found the couple's story inspiring, soon embarking for Floriana themselves. The Whitmers were a salt-of-the-earth type family whose homegrown personas clashed heavily with the Nietzsche-based philosophy and intellectualism of Ritter and his lover. The neighbors largely avoided one another, living about an hour's walk from each other's home, until the arrival of Aloise Wehrborn de Wagner-Bosquet, a self-proclaimed baroness who had come to Floriana with 2 male companions, Robert Philippson and Rudolf Lorenz. The baroness was a modern woman with grandiose tales of her life back in Europe. Regarded as stubborn, sexy, and wild, she landed on Floriana with the same pomp and circumstance as the English landed in Virginia. In her eyes, the island was instantly hers. Parading around the island in skimpy outfits, the Baroness was not shy about her male lovers and was said to greet passing ships in sheer outfits and a pistol on her hip. According to the documentary, A Galapagos Affair, the Baroness was intent on building a hotel on the island, declaring herself Empress of Floriana. Her boastful attitude and air of superiority ruffled the feathers of her neighbors, as petty conflicts arose frequently. At the same time, the Baroness had begun to favor Philip's son over Laurence, who was said to have been mistreated and often beaten by the preferred lover, seeking refuge with the Whitmers. On March 27, 1934, the island of Floriana was eerie and quiet. A sense of foreboding according to the writings of Strauch had settled over Paradise. A long-drawn scream is said to have pierced the silence that day, and then, nothing. The Baroness and her lover, Philip's son, disappeared. Here is where the murder and mystery of the Galapagos' first inhabitants grows sensational, as written accounts by the Whitmers and Strauch clash. The Whitmers and Laurence claim the Baroness and Philip's son had embarked on a boat to Tahiti, asking the family to watch their home and belongings should they return. Strauch, on the other hand, recalls in her writings that the Baroness' most prized possessions had tellingly been left at her house, while no sighting of an approaching ship had caught her or Ritter's attention. The Baroness and Philip's son were never heard from again, her larger-than-life personality and electric presence forever lost to the island of Floriana. Suspiciously, Laurence became eager to go back to Germany after the disappearance and soon made haste to the island of San Cristobal, where his boat disappeared en route only to be discovered months later with his mummified remains on Marchena Island. Ritter died months later from sour chicken that many suspect Strauch had poisoned. Claiming to have eaten as much of the rotten bird as her partner, the Whitmers remarked the oddity of Strauch waiting until Ritter was beyond saving before calling for help. While Strauch retells the death of Ritter with loving detail, the Whitmers claim his dying words were to curse Dory's very existence. Perhaps Laurence and the Whitmers had murdered the Baroness and Philip's son. Maybe Ritter and Strauch were equally involved in the killings. It's possible Strauch had killed Ritter out of spite for his cold and unloving demeanor. As with most great mysteries, the answers are forever lost to time. As for the Whitmer family, their stay on Floriana outlasted their ill-fated neighbors as they continued to live and die on the Galapagos, even opening a hotel on Floriana that remains open to this day. In the Galapagos affair, it's said an old legend surrounds the famous tortoises, for which the archipelago is named for, that these historic creatures are able to see the intentions of those who visit the Galapagos and, if decidedly armed with bad intentions, can seal a person's fate with a curse. Whether the tragic fate of the Galapagos first settlers was human nature or the mystical workings of the Galapagos tortoise, one will never know the fate of the Empress of Floriana, her lover, or the ill-fated Dr. Ritter. Number 1. Lady of the Dunes, was the unidentified Cape Cod murder victim an extra in Jaws? She was found on July 26, 1974, lying face down on a beach towel in the dunes near Provincetown, Massachusetts. Her hands were missing, and small piles of pine needles were left in their place. Her head had been crushed and nearly severed from her body, possibly with some sort of military entrenching tool. Police suggested she could have died weeks before the July 26 discovery. With no clear way to identify her, the victim soon became known as the Lady of the Dunes. Who she is, why she was slain so brutally, and who ended her life are all mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. When she was discovered, police conducted extensive searches of the surrounding dunes, combed through missing person files, and compared tire tracks found near the scene to those of countless vehicles. Yet they found nothing to explain the murder of the Lady of the Dunes. Unidentified Cape Cod murder victim an extra in Jaws? Horror author Joe Hill thinks so. Murder on the set of Jaws. Of the many mysterious and ominous places on Earth, many bodies of water are said to be cursed, haunted, or both. For whatever reason these lakes have drawn about them tales of misfortune, terror, and death, and they continue to elude rational answers. Sandra Lee, now an author, claims to have found the body 2 days prior to Leslie. At the time she was 9 years old and camping with her family in Provincetown. While walking her dog she came across the body but was too scared to tell anyone. The naked body was located 15 feet from the nearest access road and there were tire tracks nearby. There were also 2 sets of footprints that led to the body. These steps disappeared into the nearby sand. The body was that of a Caucasian female that had been dead anywhere between 10 days to 3 weeks. She was lying face down on a green beach towel. Under her head were a folded pair of Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana. Her toenails were painted pink. Despite several of her teeth being missing, she had what was described as New York-style dental work worth thousands of dollars. Her hands were also missing. Piles of pine needles had been set in the sand in place of her hands. The woman had been nearly decapitated and one side of her head had been crushed with what is believed to be a type of military entrenchment tool. This injury was determined to be the cause of death. She had been sexually assaulted, likely with a block of wood, after her death. Though she could be anywhere from the ages of 20 to 49, she is most likely between 25 and 35 years old. She had auburn or reddish hair that was being held in a ponytail with a glittery elastic band. The woman had an athletic build, weighed about 145 pounds, and was approximately 5 feet 6 inches. The unidentified woman may have been murdered while she was asleep. Because she was lying on one half of the towel, it is believed she had company. Presumably, her teeth and hands were removed by the killer in order to hide her identity. Authorities searched through thousands of missing person reports hoping to find a match. They tried to find any dentists who may have worked on the woman's teeth, and they investigated vehicles that had been driven through the area during the weeks prior to the body being found. The area was searched for more evidence but nothing was found. A woman from Maryland reached out to authorities because she suspected the unidentified woman was her sister, who also had auburn hair. The sisters had lost touch after the other moved to Boston a few months before the murder. It is unknown what happened to this lead, presumably it was inconclusive. In 1987, a Canadian woman went to the police to tell them she had seen her father strangle a woman while visiting Providence in 1974 when she was 5 years old. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police passed this information to Massachusetts police. Unfortunately, by the time police tried to contact this woman, she had moved and they were never able to track her down. At one point, the murdered woman was believed to be Rory Jean Kessinger, a drug dealer and bank robber. Rory, who had been 24 years old at the time, had escaped from Plymouth County Correctional Facility in 1973. She had been serving time for assault with intent to murder. However, DNA from Rory's mother did not match the unidentified woman. Perhaps the most interesting theory, albeit far-fetched, is one brought to light by author Joe Hill, Stephen King's son, in 2015. Joe, who was aware of the unidentified Lady of the Dunes, was watching Jaws when he noticed something interesting 54 minutes into the movie. An extra, wearing a blue bandana and jeans, resembled the unidentified woman. Jaws was filmed shortly before the murder took place, in Martha's Vineyard, a few hours away from Provincetown. Though Joe admits it's unlikely the woman in the movie is the Lady of the Dunes, an FBI agent and friend of his commented, "Odder ideas have cracked colder cases." Not only is the murdered woman still unidentified, but her killer has also never been established. Haddon Clark, a well-known murderer, admitted to killing the Lady of the Dunes. However, authorities believe his confession is false as he suffers from paranoid schizophrenia. He is currently imprisoned. Infamous mob boss James Whitey Bulger is a suspect. Witnesses recall seeing him in the area with a similar-looking woman around the time of the murder. He was a regular at the Crown and Anchor in Provincetown. Notably, Whitey was known for trying to erase his victims' identities. He was killed in 2018 by other inmates in prison. The unknown woman was buried at St. Peter's Cemetery in October of 1974. She has been exhumed twice due to technological advancements. If you have any information, contact the Provincetown Police Department at 508-487-1212. The Lady of the Dunes remains unidentified 46 years later. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed these creepy tales of death and darkness.